She called the police on me for installing solar panels on my own roof. No loud music, no wild party, not even a minor fire hazard, just clean, renewable energy. One minute I was tightening a bracket, the next, 2 squad cars were pulling into my driveway because the HOA president decided my roof looked too industrial. I didn't move out here for conflict. I came for the peace, the open space, a broken bar not to be targeted for trying to go green. What made it worse was how she acted like she was protecting the community, like I was the one causing harm. Ever dealt with an HOA that pushed too far? I'd love to hear your experience in the comments. That morning had started off perfectly. The sky was clear, my tools were organized, and I had top-tier equipment ready to go. Years of experience working with building codes and municipal guidelines had prepared me for this. Confident, I climbed my ladder and was working on the 4th panel when I heard footsteps scrunching across my gravel driveway. Looking down, I saw her approaching with a brisk, no-nonsense stride. She looked to be in her mid-40s, blonde hair perfectly styled, clutching a clipboard like it was both a badge and a weapon. There was something about her demeanor, rehearsed and authoritative, that instantly put me on edge. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. It was polite, but there was a sharpness behind it. She gave off the unmistakable air of someone who gets her way by force of will or intimidation. "Good morning," she said, in a voice that somehow managed to be both cordial and confrontational. "I'm Eileen Marlowe, president of the Forest Ridge Homeowners Association. I hope you've familiarized yourself with our community guidelines, especially the parts concerning visual harmony and neighborhood appearance." The way she said visual harmony, you'd think I was putting up a neon billboard, not high-efficiency black solar panels designed to blend seamlessly with my shingles. Trying to keep things neighborly, I climbed down, extended a hand, and said, "Albert Carter." "Nice to meet you, Eileen. These panels meet all regulations and have full county approval." Her strained smile didn't budge as she inspected the setup like she was searching for a health code violation. "Well, Albert," she said, dramatically consulting her clipboard, "county approval is the bare minimum. Our standards in Forest Ridge are considerably more a broken bar refined." She motioned to the solar panels as though they were defacing the entire street. But these weren't just any panels, they were sleek, top of the line, and blended beautifully with my dark roof tiles. She continued, "We have to protect both property values and the cohesive look of the neighborhood. I'm sure you can understand how critical that is." But her tone made it clear. This wasn't a discussion, it was an accusation disguised as concern. Then she handed me her business card. Gold embossed logo, heavy cardstock, the kind of thing meant to signal importance. She wasn't just introducing herself, she was establishing dominance. And that's when she dropped a story that chilled me. "You know," she said casually, "last year we had a terrible fire in a nearby cabin. DIY electrical work gone wrong, whole place went up in flames. Thankfully, no one was hurt, but it only took minutes." Her story was filled with just enough detail to sound legitimate. But something about it felt off. She wasn't concerned about safety, she was using fear as leverage. The only fire was her obsession with control. "We had to evacuate families," she added. "People displaced for months. We can't take those kinds of chances again." She ended with a fake, motherly tone that tried to mask the underlying threat. "I'm sure you understand where we're coming from." As she walked away, she kept glancing back at my cabin like she expected it to spontaneously combust. From my hillside, I could clearly see her house across the valley. And as I resumed work throughout the day, I kept catching glimpses of her silhouette, always standing somewhere she could watch me. It didn't feel like a neighborhood anymore. It felt like I was being monitored by someone just waiting to pounce. That sense of surveillance only deepened as the day wound down. As I packed up my tools and the evening chill rolled in, I looked out across the valley and saw her house still lit up. Through the front window, her figure stood motionless, gazing directly at my property with unsettling focus. Then my phone buzzed. A text. No name, no number. Just 8 simple words. "Stop the installation or face consequences." I stared at the message, rereading it over and over. It wasn't a warning, it was a threat. For the first time in years, I didn't feel safe in my own home. Not because of what I was building, but because of who was watching me build it. Who do you think sent that message? Was it Eileen or someone else involved? 3 days later, I found something in my mailbox that blew this whole thing wide open. Hidden among bills and junk mail was a heavy envelope made of thick, cream-colored paper with the Forest Ridge logo embossed in shiny gold. It looked like the kind of envelope meant for court notices. Inside was exactly what Eileen wanted me to find, a formal cease and desist letter. The language was stiff and aggressive, yet clearly written by someone with legal firepower. At the top, in bold capital letters, immediate cease and desist. According to the document, I was in violation of HOA Rule 15b, unauthorized solar installations. All work was to stop immediately until a formal board review could take place. The letter demanded I stop immediately and enter into a compliance review process. It was signed by Eileen Marlowe herself, her signature a flourish of self-importance, and packed with references to specific sections of the HOA's guideline as sections that supposedly governed energy systems, property alterations, and overall aesthetic standards. But it didn't read like a formal notice, it read like a veiled threat, polished and professional on the outside, but beneath it, the message was clear: obey or face consequences. Holding that letter felt like being served a lawsuit, and for a moment, I truly wondered whether I'd overlooked something when I first moved in. The language was intimidating and designed to plant doubt. It talked about fines, legal consequences, and even forced removal of non-compliant systems. It was enough to rattle anyone. But after 15 years in county planning, I've developed a healthy suspicion of anything dressed up to sound official. And I've learned the importance of digging into the fine print before taking any action. So instead of panicking or giving in to demands that felt questionable, I turned to my files. I pulled out the entire 50-page HOA agreement I'd signed when I purchased the property, along with every single addendum, amendment, and supporting document I'd been given at closing. Sticky notes marked pages, highlighter bled through text, and paper rustled like I was prepping for a courtroom battle. I combed through the contract with laser focus. There was no mention of Rule 15b anywhere. The document only listed rules up to 14 Ka, and that one was about mailbox upkeep and snow removal. Not a single word about solar panels, energy systems, or anything remotely related to what I was installing. There were only two explanations. Either I'd been given an outdated version of the rulesa, or someone had invented this entire regulation out of thin air, using official-looking letterhead and legalese to intimidate me into submission. That thought sent a surge of anger through me. I hadn't felt that kind of resolve since my early days rooting out corrupt contractors trying to bribe their way through permit approvals. When I first joined this HOA, I thought I was stepping into a place of order, structure, and security. But now it was clear the rules weren't being used to protect residents. They were being weaponized to silence them. That's when I remembered something critical from my time in county planning. HOAs can amend their rules through community voting. It hit me, what if this rule was added after I'd signed the agreement? Had there been a vote I missed? Could 15b be a new regulation I simply hadn't heard about? Determined to get to the bottom of it, I searched my email archive, going back months, looking for any communications from the HOA about policy changes, community meetings, or voting results. That's when I found a thread from March of the previous year, and what I read made my blood boil. The subject line was unmistakable: Rule 15b rejected, a motion fails 47-12. The message went on to explain that the rule had been struck down due to a direct conflict with county solar rights laws. Not only had Rule 15b been voted down, it was decisively rejected. It wasn't some obscure technicality. The rule had been denied because it violated existing legislation, a legislation I had helped write, and now Eileen was trying to enforce it as if it had passed. This wasn't just overreach or stubbornness, it was a deliberate deception. She was reviving a rule that had been buried, dressing it up with legal jargon and false authority to make it look legitimate. The realization hit like a punch. If she was willing to fabricate policies and issue fake legal threats, what else had she done? How many other homeowners had been bullied into submission, simply because they didn't know the law or didn't think they had the power to push back? I started thinking about all the horror stories I'd heard over the years about HOAs that abused their authority and crushed residents under false rules and empty threats. Now I knew firsthand how easily it could happen. This wasn't just a power trip, It was a full-blown scammer, an illusion of authority cloaked in official letterhead and cloaked threats. Eileen wasn't just being overzealous, she was running a well-oiled con built on the trust people placed in her position and the fear that comes with not knowing your rights. That realization lit a fire in me. I hadn't felt this level of resolve in years. No one should have to live under the thumb of someone exploiting their position for control, especially not people trying to make responsible, environmentally sound choices for their homes. That night, I made a decision, the one that would change everything and begin the process of exposing Eileen's entire operation. I wasn't going to back down, not when I had every permit, not when I was well within the law, and certainly not because of a rule that had never officially existed in the first place. The next morning, I would pick up right where I left off and continue the installation, fully legal, and completely unshaken. I had every legal right to continue the work, but when I stepped outside the next morning to resume installation, something immediately felt wrong. The extension ladder I'd left propped securely against the cabin the night before was gone, not moved, not knocked over, it completely vanished. I scanned the area, thinking maybe I had somehow misplaced it, but the truth hit fast. It had been taken. In the soft dirt near the base of the wall, I spotted tire tracks afresh, and definitely not from my own truck. They led away from the cabin toward the main road. Whoever came onto my property had done so during the night, and they hadn't come by accident. They came to steal. Given the circumstances and recent threats, I had a strong hunch about who might be behind this shift from passive-aggressive hostility to outright theft. What do you think happened to the ladder? Was it simply stolen, or is this turning into sabotage? I didn't have time to dwell on it. Determined to stay on course, I borrowed a ladder from the nearest neighbor and was back on the roof by 7 a.m., ready to finish installing the fifth panel. But just as I tightened the final mounting bracket, I heard a sound that made my stomach turn, the wailing echo of sirens bouncing through the quiet mountain valley. 2 police cruisers came winding up the road toward my cabin, their lights flashing like it was a raid on a major criminal operation. The sight was jarring and surreal. I stood there on my roof, tools in hand, wondering what kind of emergency could possibly involve me. The lead officer stepped out and looked up at me with firm, no-nonsense authority. "Sir," he called out, "we received a report of unsafe construction and immediate fire hazards. I need you to stop what you're doing and come down so we can talk." It was absurd, utterly ridiculous. I was fully licensed, properly permitted, and using professional-grade materials. Yet here I was, being treated like someone running an illegal backwoods experiment that could explode at any moment. What made it worse was the small crowd forming at the edge of my property. In tight-knit mountain communities, word spreads fast, and it didn't take long for a dozen curious neighbors to show up under the pretense of walking their dogs or going on morning strolls. I was forced to climb down the ladder under the watchful eyes of people I'd barely met, looking exactly like someone caught in the act of doing something dangerous. It felt like a public spectacle, staged humiliation, like someone had arranged a block party just for my shame, only nobody had bothered to bring snacks. The officer, whose badge read Rodriguez, remained professional but clearly puzzled. He glanced from his notes to my setup with growing confusion. "A woman called in a 911 report," he explained, using the careful tone of someone who's handled too many neighbor disputes. "She claimed exposed wiring, unsafe structural modifications, and an imminent fire risk. Said the whole neighborhood could be in danger." He gestured toward my panels, his expression making it clear he was struggling to match the emergency description with the very normal home improvement project he was actually looking at. I handed him all the relevant paperwork, permits, engineering specs, even my county credentials. Officer Rodriguez reviewed them carefully but ultimately informed me he had no choice. Protocol required that I pause the installation until a county building inspector could verify everything on site. "I'm sure this will get cleared up quickly," he said, offering a sympathetic shrug. But even officers with good intentions are powerless when panic meets red tape, and in a fire-prone area like ours, even a baseless complaint has to be taken seriously. What stung most wasn't the police presence, it was how quickly the perception of danger took hold. My neighbors didn't know me. All they saw were flashing lights, whispered accusations, and an officer asking me to stop my work. Phones came out, Nobody spoke. It was like I had become the morning news. I was no longer the new guy installing solar panels. I was the guy creating hazards. The exact kind of homeowner the HOA loves to correct. And I couldn't shake the feeling that this entire incident had gone exactly how Eileen hoped it would when she picked up the phone. After the officers left and the crowd slowly drifted away, I sat on my porch, overwhelmed with a mix of anger, embarrassment, and a growing sense that I was being targeted, and not for any real wrongdoing, but because someone wanted me silenced and humiliated. That's when I heard quiet footsteps scrunching along the gravel driveway. I looked up to see an elderly man walking slowly toward me, glancing around nervously as if checking to make sure no one else saw him. He had a weathered face, a cautious expression, and eyes that held the weight of someone who'd seen more than he'd ever said out loud. When he reached me, he extended his hand and spoke in a low, hushed voice, like he was about to share a dangerous secret. "Albert," he said, giving my hand a firm shake. "Name's Hank Porter. I live in the blue cabin just down the hill," he said, settling onto the porch step with deliberate calm. "Been part of this community for over 15 years, and what I'm about to tell you might change the way you look at everything that's happened." Hank looked me straight in the eye with the gravity of someone about to deliver a truth too important to soften. "There's never been a cabin fire here. Not last year. Not ever." He paused for a moment, letting those words land. "The most serious emergency we've had in Forest Ridge was a cat that got stuck in a tree." I blinked, trying to process what he had just said. Hank continued, his tone now firmer, more resolute. "I used to be a high school principal, and I've kept detailed records of every incident, emergency, and event in this community. Documentation was part of who I was. And I can tell you with complete certainty Eileen Marlowe is lying, not just to you, but to the police, and to everyone else in this neighborhood." The weight of his words hit me hard. Everything suddenly clicked into place. I'd been publicly humiliated, painted as a danger to the community, all based on a lie. There had been no fire, no past tragedy, no safety precedent. Eileen had fabricated the entire story to justify calling the authorities and shutting down my perfectly legal solar project. "She's been doing this for years," Hank said, now visibly angry. "I've watched her twist rules, invent threats, and bully neighbors into silence. Most people don't know how to stand up to someone who sounds official and waves around a clipboard." Something shifted in me at that moment. My frustration and embarrassment evolved into something sharper: righteous determination. This wasn't just about a solar installation anymore. It was about exposing someone who had turned an HOA into a personal kingdom built on fear, lies, and manipulation. I sat on the porch long after Hank walked back down the hill, the sun casting long shadows up the valley. I'd spent years dealing with crooked contractors and shady bureaucrats, but this felt different. This was personal. It was happening in my own backyard. Still reeling from the revelation, I began to piece together just how deep this might go. If she lied about a fire, what else had she invented over the years? How many other residents had she strong-armed into compliance using rules that didn't exist? I opened my laptop and started researching Eileen's background, digging through public records, forums, HOA website, anything I could find. I typed her name into the search bar, bracing myself for what might come up. What do you think I uncovered? A criminal past? Or perhaps a long list of other victims? You tell me. The next morning, I drove down to the Pine Grove County FSCA, the same building where I'd spent 15 years of my career. I knew every hallway, every filing cabinet, and every loophole in the bureaucratic maze most people found impossible to navigate. As I walked in, the receptionist lit up with recognition. "Albert Carter, how's retirement treating you?" she said with a smile. "Heard you bought that place up in Forest Ridge. Living the dream, huh?" I returned the smile, leaning into the persona of the well-adjusted retiree. "It's been fantastic," I said, "just doing a little routine digging. I want to make sure I've got a handle on the local rules and finances now that I'm settling in." She directed me to the Public Records Archive, where HOA documents were legally required to be maintained. I settled into a familiar rhythm, page after page, line by line. The beauty of public record laws is that any HOA that manages shared spaces and collects dues must maintain a transparent paper trail. If you know how to look and IDO, you can find years of financial records and community filings. I started with the most recent budget reports and worked my way backward, scanning for red flags and unusual expenses, inconsistent entries, and vague line items that didn't make sense for a small mountain community with basic upkeep needs. At first, everything looked standard: landscaping contracts, snow clearing costs, general insurance premiums, and nothing surprising. But then, buried in the section labeled administrative expenses, I found something that made my pulse spike. $75,000. No explanation, no receipts, no breakdown, just a line item labeled safety consulting. My hands tightened around the page. For a community of fewer than 100 homes, that amount was outrageous. And the complete lack of supporting documentation? That wasn't just sloppy, it was deliberate. To someone without a background in municipal budgeting, it might have passed unnoticed, but I'd overseen enough public funds to know exactly what I was looking at. This was the hallmark of a shell company created to siphon money out of the HOA under the guise of services that were never actually performed. Those consulting fees weren't just suspicious, they were the tip of something far bigger. My instincts, sharpened by years of catching contractors who tried to scam county projects, immediately kicked in. I started tracing the origins of the entity listed on the ledger, M Solutions, LLC. Finding that name was like finding fingerprints at a crime scene. A quick dive into corporate filings confirmed what I feared, that the owner was Lance Marlowe, Eileen's brother-in-law. I cross-checked property records, marriage certificates, and family court files. The connections weren't just relative, they were unmistakable and damning. Eileen wasn't merely inventing rules to harass neighbors, she was creating entire false emergencies and safety crises to funnel home money directly into her family's pockets. M Solutions wasn't just a vendor, it was the financial engine of a deeply rooted scam. As I combed through the last 3 years of HOA financials, the pattern became disturbingly clear. There was a consistency to the manipulation that almost bordered on professional. A tree trimmer, $15,000. A deer spotted near a walking trail, $12,000. Mailbox paint a few shades off, $8,000. A squirrel found in a rain gutter, $5,000 for a water flow analysis. Each time there was a laughable safety incident, M Solutions showed up, billed the HOA, and somehow left without fixing a single issue. The paper trail revealed that nearly 40% of the HOA's entire budget over that period had gone to this shell company under vague service labels and non-existent deliverables. Money meant for real maintenance, repaving roads, improving lighting, fixing actual drainage issues, was quietly siphoned into fake consulting gigs. To an average homeowner, it would have seemed like official business, but to someone like me, who'd spent a career auditing municipal budgets and flagging fraud, the deception was obvious. This wasn't just mismanagement, it was intentional design, a system crafted to thrive in silence, hidden behind legal jargon, printed newsletters, and community apathy. And Eileen was the architect. She had counted on her position to shield her, on the trust of her neighbors, and on the fact that no one would ever question her version of the truth. She never anticipated someone like me moving in. As I was printing copies of the most incriminating records, my phone buzzed with a call from an unlisted number. I answered. "Stop digging, Albert," said a cold, familiar voice. "Or regret it." Then the line went dead. No name, no explanation, just a direct, unmistakable threat. And suddenly, this wasn't just about financial fraud. This was about power and how far someone would go to protect it. Is Eileen just bluffing, or is this about to get truly dangerous? That evening, I didn't just build a timeline, I built a case. I converted my living room wall into a command center, printed documents, covered every surface, arranged by date and incident. I used red string to connect false rules, fabricated emergencies, and inflated payouts to M Solutions. From a distance, it looked like the kind of conspiracy wall you would see in a crime drama, but this one was real. Still, I knew a direct confrontation would go nowhere. Eileen would deny everything, twist the narrative, and cast me as an unstable newcomer with a personal vendetta. I needed a smarter approach, one that exposed her publicly, in front of people who couldn't ignore the evidence. So I crafted an email. It was precise, polite, and deliberately incomplete. I sent it to every homeowner in the Forest Ridge community. In the email, I shared only a fraction of what I'd uncovered, just enough to raise questions, not accusations. I attached the vote records and emails regarding Rule 15b, clearly showing that it had been rejected. I didn't mention M Solutions. I didn't mention the financial fraud. Not yet. I wasn't lighting the dynamite. I was tossing a match near a fuse, just enough to make her feel cornered. And she took the bait. Within 2 hours, every inbox in Forest Ridge lit up with Eileen's fiery response. She called me a liar, accused me of endangering property values, and painted herself as a victim. Her email was a masterclass in deflection and character assassination. She claimed I bullied elderly women, undermined public safety, and was trying to destroy everything the community stood for. Her defensiveness was telling. She hadn't just taken the bait, she'd bitten down hard. And now, all I had to do was wait for her to call a meeting, because when she did, I'd be ready with the real evidence. Those vague consulting fees weren't just suspicious, they were the crack in the dam. My instincts, sharpened by years of chasing down shady contractors trying to scam county departments, took over. I began unraveling the corporate structure behind M Solutions LLC. What I found was the smoking gun. The registered owner, Lance Marlowe, Eileen's brother-in-law. Cross-referencing public records, including property deeds, marriage filings, and court documents, confirmed the connection in undeniable terms. This wasn't a coincidence. It was calculated. Eileen wasn't just inventing HOA rules out of thin air, she was fabricating emergencies and safety concerns to funnel HOA funds into her own family's hands, using M Solutions as the front. The deeper I went, the darker it got. I combed through 3 full years of financial reports. What emerged was a staggering scheme of deceit. It wasn't just 1 or 2 questionable charges, it was systemic. $15,000 for earth tremor mitigation, $12,000 tied to a wildlife hazard involving a deer, $8,000 because a homeowner painted their mailbox the wrong shade of green, $5,000 for an emergency water flow assessment triggered by a squirrel in a gutter. None of it made sense unless you realized it was all theater. The real emergency was how these made-up incidents were used to justify wildly inflated payments to M Solutions. The company always seemed to show up right after a crisis, offer vague consulting, and disappear with thousands of dollars without ever actually solving anything. By the time I tallied the numbers, I realized nearly 40% of the HOA's budget over 3 years had been drained this way. Money meant for road repairs, snow removal, or community improvements had vanished into a black hole of corruption. It wasn't just irresponsibly, it was intentional. Most residents would never catch it. They wouldn't know to request financials, and even if they did, few would have the background to understand what they were seeing. But to someone who had audited city budgets for years, the red flags were blinding. This wasn't mismanagement. It was a system, built on misinformation and fear, running silently under the surface, and Eileen was the one who designed it. She knew people trusted authority. She knew they'd assume the president of the HOA was working in their best interest. And she knew most of them would never question what looked like official business. But I had the full picture now. And just as I was printing out copies of the most damning documents, my phone rang. No name, no number, just the call. Stop digging, Albert, or regret it. It was Eileen. Her voice was cold, flat, measured, the kind of threat that doesn't need to shout. Then a click, dead air. I stared at the phone, realizing she'd just raised the stakes. This wasn't about disputes anymore. It was about power, and she was willing to threaten to protect it. That night, I didn't just put together a timeline, I built a case. I turned my living room into a command center. Every printout was laid out chronologically. Every fake rule, every false emergency, every shady dollar that found its way into M Solutions. Red string crisscrossed a giant corkboard, connecting names, dates, events, and payments. The fraud wasn't just obvious, it was irrefutable. But I also knew that going directly to Eileen with it would be useless. She'd deny it, accuse me of fabricating evidence, play the victim, maybe even try to turn the neighborhood against me. So I needed a better plan. I decided to play chess, not checkers. I'd bait Hera publicly. I crafted a well-worded email and sent it to every homeowner in Forest Ridge. But I didn't reveal everything. I gave them just enough to provoke a reaction. The records from the failed vote on Rule 15b and the email exchanges proving Eileen tried to enforce it anyway. I left out the financial fraud entirely for now. This wasn't the bomb. It was the spark, enough to make her feel threatened, enough to force her hand. And it worked faster than I expected. Within 2 hours, a response from Eileen blasted into every inbox in the community. She called me a liar, accused me of trying to destroy property values, claimed I was harassing elderly residents. It was textbook manipulation and classic deflection, an aggressive attempt to shift focus off the facts and onto my character. But her rage gave something away. She was rattled. Her email was a transparent smear campaign, a desperate attempt to cast me as a dangerous outsider intent on causing chaos. But beneath the surface, it was clear Eileen was scared, and I hadn't even dropped the real evidence yet. Eileen's email was a masterclass in deflection and damage control. She accused me of violating community guidelines, of harassing board members, and of deliberately spreading falsehoods aimed at dismantling the very values the community was built upon. She painted me as an outsider with a vendetta, someone said, on tearing apart what she called a peaceful, family-friendly neighborhood. Then came the personal attack. "I've done everything I can to work with Mr. Carter," she claimed, adopting a tone of weary grace. "But his aggressive behavior, especially toward women my age, is becoming increasingly disturbing. We cannot allow his reckless actions and inflammatory accusations to endanger the harmony we've spent years building." Several neighbors around the room nodded in visible agreement. Her performance was calculated, authoritative yet sympathetic, the image of a devoted community leader unfairly persecuted. Then Hank stood up. When he requested time to speak as a long-term resident with relevant information, the mood shifted. People expected him to offer support for Eileen's version of events, or maybe to reinforce the accusations against me. But Hank had come prepared. After years of biting his tongue, he was finally ready to speak. He walked to the front with quiet, deliberate confidence, the presence of someone who had spent a lifetime commanding attention in high school auditoriums and faculty meetings. "Friends, neighbors," he began, his voice carrying the calm weight of someone respected more for integrity than authority. "I've lived here for 15 years. I've seen this place grow. I've watched good people repaint decks 3 times because of arbitrary rules. I've watched retirees waste pension money fixing things that didn't need fixing. And I've kept my mouth shut until now." He pulled out a stack of documents and began laying out the truth in a way no one could ignore. Hank walked the crowd through the voting records that had officially struck down Rule 15b, the emails that showed Eileen enforcing it anyway, and the timeline that proved she had done so knowingly, despite its rejection. Gasps and whispers filled the room as neighbors began to realize they had been deceived, not by a rumor, but by the very person they had elected to lead. "If our board president is enforcing imaginary rules," Hank said, his voice steady and clear, "and lying about community decisions, a broken bar, what else might she be hiding? What other policies have been pushed through without proper input or legal authority?" And that's when Eileen snapped. She slammed her hand on the table, her carefully managed persona cracking like glass under pressure. "Do you have any idea how hard I work to keep this place from becoming a dump?" she shouted, her tone dripping with bitterness. "I don't have to stand here and listen to senile old men who clearly don't understand how community governance works." Her voice rose with every word, unraveling her entire facade. "You think any of you know what it takes to maintain property values, to manage legal frameworks? You all want to play expert until something breaks." The room went deathly still. What had begun as a public defense had become a tirade of contempt. People glanced at one another, expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. The trust she had so carefully cultivated was collapsing in real time. I caught Hank's eye. He gave me the slightest note, a quiet confirmation that this was the moment we'd been waiting for. Then he turned back to the room and said calmly, "Maybe it's time we ask someone who actually does know about zoning law and community policy." He handed me the microphone. Thanks to a clause in the HOA bylaws that allow direct responses to character-based accusations, I had exactly 3 minutes to speak, and that was all I needed. I connected my laptop to the projector and queued up my opening slides. The first showed my name on the Pine Grove County Zoning Reform Initiative. The second displayed my signature on the clause guaranteeing solar access rights, a law Eileen had pretended didn't exist. I turned to face the room. "I didn't just read the law you tried to fake," I said, letting the silence stretch as the words sank in. "I wrote it." You could hear the tension leave the room in a slow exhale, the realization landing like a gavel strike. Faces that had once looked skeptical were now wide-eyed, watching a narrative unravel in real time. And I wasn't done. I didn't just help write the regulations, I wrote them. Every policy on solar installations, every residential safety protocol, every environmental safeguard designed for mountain communities like ours. I spent 3 years building the framework that governs every inch of construction and property modification in this county. The shift in the room was immediate. 60 people, neighbors, skeptics, and longtime residents suddenly saw the truth. Eileen hadn't just been challenged, she'd been exposed by someone with the legal authority she only pretended to have. But I wasn't done. I advanced the slide. "This," I said, "is why Eileen has been inventing rules and manufacturing fake emergencies." The screen lit up with records of bank transfers, corporate filings, family trees, and a damning financial trail. It was all there. $180,000 siphoned from the HOA over 3 years, fraudulent consulting contracts, a shell company, M Solutions LLC, owned by none other than Eileen's brother-in-law, Lance Marlowe. "She invents crises," I explained, "fictional code violations, safety hazards that don't exist. Then she bills you to fix the AIM through her family's fake consulting firm." Gasps rippled through the room as residents began connecting the dots. "You made my husband repaint that deck 3 times. One woman yelled. "That mailbox cost me $600. Shouted another. "I tore down my garden shed because of your threats." It was as if a dam had burst, and not of rage, but of clarity. Phones were out instantly. People started dialing the police, taking photos of the evidence, and recording what had become an undeniable moment of reckoning. Eileen stood frozen, her face pale as she tried to recover, frantically claiming the documents were fake or taken out of context. But the tide had already turned. Her words sounded like static, desperate, unraveling, and increasingly incoherent as residents demanded specifics. Where was the invoice? What project did that $15,000 cover? Why did no one remember the emergency M Solutions billed for? And then, through the open windows, came the sound of sirens. Officers arrived minutes later, summoned not by me but by the people Eileen had deceived. And just before she could be escorted out, Eileen launched one last desperate shot. "You think this is over, Albert?" she spat. "You have no idea what I know about your past. You might want to check your county pension records when you get home. You'll regret crossing me." For a heartbeat, her words landed, but only for a heartbeat. Then it hit me. This was all she had left. Another lie. Another empty threat from someone whose entire legacy was built on deception, manipulation, and the abuse of trust. What do you think? Was it one final card to play, or just another bluff? Type final twist if you think she has more secrets, or empty threat if you think her power is gone. The fallout came faster, and for once, justice was just as swift. Within 15 minutes, police officers placed Eileen under arrest. Between the financial records, eyewitness accounts, and blatant misuse of public funds, it was a textbook case of HOA fraud. Her brother-in-law's company accounts were frozen that same evening. By week's end, the county district attorney had opened a formal investigation, one that would become a model case for prosecuting homeowner association corruption across the state. And on Tuesday, Forest Ridge held an emergency election. Hank Porter won unanimously. His first official act as HOA president was to appoint an independent forensic accountant to audit the last 5 years of community spending. The final numbers were even worse than what I'd uncovered. Over $200,000 had been siphoned away through fake invoices, bogus emergencies, and consulting contracts designed to hide theft in plain sight. A complex network of shell companies. No oversight, no actual services rendered. But now, there was a new chapter being written, one rooted in transparency, accountability, And for the first time in years the truth. The fraud hadn't just drained the HOA of funds, it had bled the community of trust, dignity, and peace of mind. But in the aftermath, that damage finally began to heal. M Solutions LLC was officially dissolved, its assets seized by court order for restitution to the HOA fund. Lance Marlowe, Eileen's brother-in-law and partner in crime, was arrested shortly after, charged with conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering, and racketeering. Prosecutors described their operation as a systematic criminal enterprise, one designed to fabricate problems just so they could profit from fixing them. The local paper ran the headline, "Retired County Planner Uncovers Massive HOA Fraud." Suddenly, my quiet retirement wasn't so quiet anymore. The attention was unexpected and frankly, unwelcome, but it served a purpose. Other communities began asking questions, watching for signs of similar corruption in their own HOAs. And just like that, Eileen's fall became a catalyst for change. What meant the most to me, though, were the conversations that followed. Residents came forward with stories that were heartbreaking and validating. A woman near the front gate had been forced to repaint her deck 3 times based on color codes that didn't exist. Each time cost her over $1,000, accompanied by threats of fines and legal action if she didn't comply. A young couple in cabin 12 paid nearly $5,000 for mailbox and landscaping violations, including being forced to replace a perfectly good mailbox with one only available through a vendor who, it turned out, was kicking back a cut to M Solutions. A single mother admitted she'd nearly sold her house out of sheer frustration. "I thought it was me," she said. Turns out, she was the system. A veteran shook his head. "I've been through actual combat zones, but nothing drained me like her constant warnings, all of them fake." An elderly gentleman had spent 2 years being harassed over garden height violations. He'd torn up and replanted expensive flowers again and again, flowers that had never actually broken a single rule. One resident summed it up with quiet, stunned relief. "We all thought we were losing our minds." But it hadn't been confusion, it had been control. And now, for the first time in years, people realized they hadn't been crazy, they'd been conned. 3 weeks later, I completed my solar installation, and no interference, no delays, no mysterious violations. The system worked perfectly. During peak sunlight, it generated 108% of my cabin's energy needs, enough to sell back to the grid. At that rate, it would pay for itself in under 7 years. Every morning, I'd sip my coffee, check the power meter, and watch the numbers run backwards. A daily reminder that the law does work when you make it visible, and when people have the courage to hold abusers accountable. Across the valley, Eileen's former home went up for sale. Its price reduced sign updated 3 times before anyone was willing to buy a property tied to the most notorious embezzlement case in county HOA history. Its declining price tag became a symbol to neighbors, real consequences for people who thought they were untouchable. But the most poetic moment came about 8 weeks after the storm had cleared. It was a crisp, clear morning. I was on my deck, mug in hand, watching my panels catch the gold pink of sunrise and calculating how much I was saving in real time, when I heard the slow roll of a vehicle on the mountain road below. A white county transport van crawled up the slope toward the courthouse. Through the reinforced rear window, I caught a glimpse of her, Eileen Marlowe, in an orange jumpsuit, shackled and silent, en route to her sentencing hearing. And seated beside her in the front passenger seat was Officer Rodriguez, the same deputy who'd once been called to shut down my dangerous solar project, now escorting the very woman who had made that false report. That moment said everything. Justice had arrived on 4 wheels and its own timetable, but it had arrived. Officer Rodriguez trailed the transport van in his patrol car. As he passed, he spotted me on my deck. He slowed just long enough to roll down his window and offer a small nod and a thumbs up, an unspoken acknowledgement that we had both come full circle. It wasn't revenge I felt, it was repair. For every fake rule, every petty threat, every dollar stolen, and every ounce of fear Eileen had spread like smoke across this valley, justice had finally arrived, and not in some dramatic blaze, but in quiet, lawful permanence. I raised my coffee mug in a silent salute as the convoy disappeared around the bend toward town. Behind those bars, Eileen would now spend years reflecting on the cost of fraud, abuse, and underestimating someone who happened to know the law better than she ever cared to learn. 6 months later, the final legal proceedings concluded, her appeals were denied. And as for that last-minute threat about my pension, exactly what I'd suspected, total fiction. There was nothing wrong with my records and no errors, no skeletons, no issues. Just another bluff from someone whose entire world was built on lies and intimidation. With Eileen gone and the rot cut out, something remarkable happened. People started showing up again. Monthly town halls became standing room only. Budgets were posted publicly, in color, tacked proudly to the clubhouse bulletin board. And under Hank's steady leadership, Forest Ridge transformed into the kind of place everyone had once imagined it could be. A community, not a battleground. Rules were written down and voted on. Financials were transparent. And respect for each other, for property, for fairness was no longer optional, it was expected. I agreed to serve as the community's unofficial legal and regulatory consultant. No title, no paycheck, just quiet oversight, ensuring decisions were grounded in real law, not invented authority. My solar installation now runs at peak efficiency. The meter spins backward on sunny days, saving more than just money. It reminds me that when you fight for what's right, even when it's harder, you can make real, lasting change. The final irony still makes me smile. Eileen tried to block a perfectly legal, environmentally responsible solar system. In doing so, she exposed a criminal scheme that had been quietly draining this community for years. All because she picked the wrong person to push around. Sometimes, when you stand up to bullies and demand accountability, you uncover a deeper problem than you expected. And sometimes, despite the noise, the threats, and the doubt, the truth does win. The good guys can win. And that, my friends, is the end of this story. If you enjoyed watching a corrupt HOA president get exposed and justice served, go ahead and tap that like button. And tell me in the comments, what's the worst HOA nightmare you've ever lived through or heard about? I read every comment, and I'd love to hear your stories. Let's shine a light on every corner where fake authority hides. Remember, knowledge is power, documentation is armor, and sometimes, the best defense against corruption is refusing to be intimidated by someone who thinks a clipboard and a title makes them untouchable. Thanks for hanging out today. This is Anna Dramanest signing off. And hey, go binge a few more stories. You won't be able to stop.